Hey Joel, thanks for the questions. These are really good and actually very informative. So hope you don't mind that I respond with a video instead of a page or so of text that might get confusing and scrambling to get through. You're right. It does feel like some of the categories in the rubric are really paired up well, especially identifying gaps in the histography and the analysis of future directions. I really think that that's really fits each other, right? If you tell me where the gaps are, the next natural step would be to tell me how you think you could fill those. So, dead on with that. And I hadn't thought about it in pairs before until I read your question, and then I'm kind of sitting here scratching my head. How could I have taught this for 7 straight terms and not seen it? So. You've got 3 questions. I'll try to take those on in order as best I can. And am I good with 4 subheadings as opposed to 8? Short answer is yes. Longer answer is yeah, I'm being evaluated on how I grade everything. Rubrics, how I participate in discussion posts, all kinds of fun stuff. But don't worry about it. You got to write your paper and you got to cover what's called for in the rubric. Let me deal with the administrative side, and if the dean gets too frustrated at me, he can always give me a shout. He kind of has my email and phone number, right? But to your last point, yeah, I don't get a whole lot of input, like 0, into the building of the rubric. Turn in suggestions on occasion, and at times they get taken, and other times I get thanks for my interest in national defense. So, all right, more serious topic here. Expound on the difference between significance and impact of the topic as I read those. All right, everything we're going to talk about in this response comes out of the proficient column in your rubric, because exemplary is really boils down to you did everything to be proficient, but you had really good, specific, nailed down, no way to avoid making the point with this, examples to support your points, right? So, and I think we talked about that in a video earlier in the term. So let's just stick with what's specific. Significance of the topic situates the topic in a greater time frame and scope of American history within the course, connecting it to, things that look like historical lenses for the founding of the nation. And then impact says, explain the topic's significance for and consequences on other events, people, institutions, etc. The way I'm looking at this, significance says, of the topic, talks about why this topic is important in American history. Especially this time frame, right? Early American nation. So why is my historiographical examination of this topic, why is the topic itself important as it relates to the culture of the young nation? And we'll take an easy one here. Why is slavery an important topic to this era? The impact of the topic is where you use that to set up, say slavery was significant, but it also impacted these other things or these other events. So off the top of my head, if we're talking about the significance of slavery in the founding of the nation, set the culture up for people who didn't agree with it and how they approached American culture, and people who were supporters of slavery in that institution and why they were inclined to think that way. The impact is slavery then led to a bigger thing that created a armed conflict inside the nation, where we saw 13 of our state, or 11, we saw a lot of the states withdraw from their contractual agreement to be part of the United States, to go form a different type of nation. and how a war was fought to hold a nation together, and then the outputs of that war being the end of slavery as it was configured at the time, the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and 15, and their impacts, and all the cultural and social impacts that followed on after that. So that's kind of wordy, but that's how I look at those. Significance is why it's important. Impact is how that topic drove other things that came either during the time or later. Okay. Historiographical context. Your question is, historiographical context says we need to assess the sources, while credibility of sources said we need to analyze them. That's a really fine distinction. And again, we'll go to the rubric. Historiographical context talks about assess major sources specific to your topic, describing the methodologies and biases within the sources, and that's where the key is. Credibility of sources talks about analyzes the major work to determine what they do well and what they did not do well, as in terms of contributing to our understanding of this topic. So for the first part, the historiographical context. Where do the sources fit in the historiography? Is the source you're using something that is common to the historiographical record, or is it an outlier? How did the historian look at that topic? Methodologies. Did they use primary sources? Was it mostly secondary sources? Where do their biases come in? What did they omit? What did they gloss over? That type of thing. If you're talking about Andrew Jackson in the historiographical context, is it like the book American Lion, where it's a fairly balanced summary of Jackson with not enough attention paid to a couple of areas, but overall balanced? Or is it a biography of Jackson that might have been written in the 1940s, 50s, where he was still considered one of our greatest presidents before the shift to something that had been written in the past 20 years, where the focus really was on his status as a slave owner and how that broke out? Okay. Credibility of the sources, and of course the bias comes in there, right? Where did the author look, and can you, in that example, can you read the part of the article, paper, book, whatever it is, journal entry, and go, wow, this is really biased against Jackson, ignores a lot of things that were positive, or was this really biased for Jackson and ignores all the negative? Did they select sources that supported only one view when they went into their methodologies? So that's historiographical context, which does pair up well and bleed over into credibility of sources a little bit. Analyze the major work to determine what they do well and what they do not do in contributing. This also covers, and this is a note that some folks got in the book review this week, about you just come in and go, well, this book was written by John Smith, and not tell us anything about John Smith. John Smith is a professor, won a Pulitzer Prize, professor emeritus for life at some institution where his study is one particular topic, and that happens to be what he's writing about right now. As opposed to, this is John Smith, who has a degree from a community college that included 2 history classes, and he's a really heavy editor on Wikipedia. So credibility of sources, you also need to establish a baseline for that source. And that can be, that does not have to be in depth. Okay, hear me out here. You can say Professor John Smith wrote this book, which was nominated for the Great Histories of the South by the Daughters of the Confederacy magazine. And while that might not be the most credible of sources, and I'll refer you back to the announcement earlier in the class to talk about the credibility of your sources, But that's all it needs. Here's the person that wrote it. Here's a clause in a sentence about why they are a credible historian, and move on. That helps a lot there. If we're just listing sources out and not saying a little bit about their authenticity, then that kind of puts your own work at a little bit of a question mark. Like, Tony's using a lot of sources here, but he never really clarifies who they are, so I don't know if they're that great. And I'm going to have to go dig into the bibliography at the end to do some research on my own to figure out if Tony is exhibiting biases and if Tony's just frankly making stuff up, right? So that's really what I'm looking for there. See, those are the questions you ask, and you're right. I'm really happy you put this in the general questions thread because I think these are some things that oftentimes students stumble over and don't really segment them out so that we can see how they play out. While I've got it up, let me take a quick look at the rest of the rubric. You didn't ask, but let's talk about it for a second. The difference between development and reasons for development is kind of self-explanatory. The historiographical development shows the path, so to speak, that the historiography has taken from point A to point B over the course of your sources. The reasons for are as simple as, we moved from looking at the origins of the War of 1812 through a military lens with early historians to a lens, more of a cultural, social lens with authors like Taylor, because over time the focus of all historians has shifted. It would have been really difficult a few decades ago to find a lot of good quality cultural, social, or gender lens writings about early American culture. Over the last few decades, we've seen a shift in how the nation looks at itself holistically and what's important to people, and that shift has led to that change. Okay? So that's really what we're looking at there. This has gone about 3 minutes longer than I anticipated when I sat down to do it, so I appreciate your time and your patience. If this doesn't scratch the itch, feel free to drop back into the comments and let me know, and I'll be happy to try to clarify. If anybody would like to get some kind of personal one-on-one better explanation of the criteria or better explanation of what I'm talking about, let me know. We can set up a video chat at some point. Folks, I appreciate it, and have a great Tuesday and rest of the week, or Monday night if you happen to be online and catch it. Thank you.